Hello everybody and a very warm welcome back to my latest video. I do hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today I want to talk about a topic which is absolutely fascinating to me, and it's the rise and fall of the 1970s tech scam record labels. And we're going to discuss why they were there, how the scheme worked, what the consequences for the artists were who were featured on the albums. And I also want to present to you a couple of now highly sought after tech scam records. So let's dive into the tech scam record labels from the 1970s. The 1970s was a transformative decade for the music industry, with rock, funk, jazz and soul thriving. However, behind the scenes, a series of fraudulent record labels emerged, not to create hit records, but to exploit tax loopholes. These so-called tech scam record labels were not interested in commercial success. Intentionally, these labels focused on releasing albums by unknown artists and using demo tapes that were collecting dust in some studio vaults. However, some of these tech scam labels became so bold that they began issuing albums featuring major artists like James Brown and the Beatles, despite that these musicians were being signed to major labels. In many cases, the rights to these recordings were never cleared, and the artists were neither informed nor compensated for using their material. Some band names and song titles were even altered, leading to musicians discovering their unauthorized releases only years later, sometimes even decades. As a result, album covers often feature generic artwork with no images of the actual bands. Despite their shady origins, many of the albums released by these labels have become highly sought-after collectibles. Some of the music, once forgotten, has been rediscovered. But how did the tax scam actually work? The mechanics of these tax shelters were relatively simple, but also very effective. Wealthy investors or businessmen looking for tax write-offs would establish a record label under their corporate umbrella. They would then sign artists, often without their knowledge, by acquiring demo tapes, unreleased material, or even low-quality recordings from unknown musicians. The label would then press a small number of albums, typically between 50 and 1,000 copies, and release them with little or no promotion. Since the IRS allowed businesses to deduct losses, the label would claim that the album's production costs were significantly higher than they were actually. By inflating these losses, the parent company or investor could write off substantial amounts on their tax returns, reducing their overall tax liability. These records were not meant to be commercially successful. Many of them were never stocked in record stores, and few received radio airplay. Actually, in many cases, those records were stocked in warehouses. In some cases, the musicians featured on these albums were completely unaware that their work had even been released. But how did the scheme actually work? Well, that's quite simple. Actually, just 5 steps. First, establish a label. Investors or companies created a record label under their corporate structure. For example, Roulette had Tiger Lily. Second, acquire unreleased or unfinished music. They would collect demo tapes, discharge recordings or unfinished sessions from unknown artists, sometimes without their permission. And I strongly believe that in most cases it was done without ever asking an artist of their permission. Third, press a limited number of records. These records were pressed in small quantities, like I said in the beginning, anywhere between 50 to 1,000 copies, to create the illusion of a commercial release. 4. Inflate production costs. The label would report massive expenses for recordings, marketing and distribution, even though these costs were artificially extracted. And that was very simple. Oh well, yeah, we had to rent a studio. we had to rent an engineer, we had to hire musicians, and we had to hire the songwriters and the producers, and all in all cost, even for this recording alone, was a couple of thousand, not even $10,000s. When they didn't even have those costs, they just got demo recordings and put them on record. And what's the last thing to do is claim business losses. By showing these losses on paper, the company would write off large sums on their taxes, reducing their taxable income significantly. It was very important that these labels never expected to turn a profit. In fact, profitability would have been a horrible thing for the whole scheme. The fewer records sold, the more losses could be reported to the IRS. A very good example of this is Gene Townsend's Time Wounds All Heals. According to Gene, the album created quite a buzz. And he was appearing in Mexico, doing live shows, and people asked for his record. So he constantly called Dobry Records, please send over copies. I can sell them here, it would be great. And also at the same time in LA, people heard about that record and started requesting that album. But Dobry couldn't deliver because there weren't really many pressed. And it was a really shock for them to find out that the album gets tension. So they did everything in their power to stop that tension. But what are notorious tax scam record labels? Well, many tax scam record labels appeared during the 1970s, to be more specific, starting around 1976, each releasing a strange mix of forgotten, unfinished, or unauthorized music. Some of the most infamous record labels were Tiger Lily Records. It was founded as a subsidiary of Roulette Records, a label notorious for its mob connections under owner Morris Levy. Tiger Lily released albums that were actually demo tapes from unsigned artists. Albums were often pressed in extremely small quantities, fewer than 1,000. I even heard rumors that there were less than 100 pressed from certain releases. And a notable release from Tiger Lily was Stonewall from 1976. That's a rare hard rock album that is now an absolutely collector's item. If you find one, it's selling for at least a couple of $1,000s. Because back in the day, when it was pressed, it was just available as a promo, so you can imagine that just a handful of these records even exist. The next one would be Guinness Records. It was created as a part of a similar tax shelter scheme and released a mix of rock, soul and jazz albums, many of which were likely unauthorized. Baby Grand Records, lesser known but part of the same system. And a notable release from Baby Grand is Terra, released in 1977, which is a soul funk album that became also a valuable vinyl rarity. I have to admit, it is my absolute favorite tax shelter label of all time, TSG. And it focused primarily on funk and soul records. Some of the releases were legit, while others were reused demo tapes. And we get to some releases from all of these labels later in the video. Another one is Globe, Tomorrow and Koala Records. The smaller labels followed the same scheme, of course, and released unmarketed records purely for financial write-offs. That scheme went on for a couple of years, but it didn't take too long for the IRS to discover that something shady was going on. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the IRS began cracking down on shelter tax schemes across multiple industries, including the record business. Investigators discovered that these labels were intentionally inflating their losses. While no major crime charges were filled, the loophole these labels exploit was closed. Records labels were required to prove actual marketing and distribution efforts, making the tax scam unprofitable. While no major crime charges were filled, the loophole these labels exploited was closed. Record labels were required to prove actual marketing and distribution efforts, making the tax scam not profitable. By the early 1980s, most of these labels has disappeared, leaving behind a collection of obscure and nearly forgotten albums. Ironically, many of the recordings released as part of the scam have become highly collectible due to their rarity. Some albums that were meant to be forgotten have been rediscovered and praised by vinyl collectors and music historians. The 1970s TechScam Records label were a unique blend of financial fraud and unintentional music preservation. What started as a way for investors to cheat the system ended up creating a legacy of raw and collectible albums. While these albums were never meant to produce hit records, they have left an undeniable mark on the vinyl culture. Today, collectors continue to track down these obscure releases, turning what was once a tech scam into a goldmine for rare groove enthusiasts. Wherever you are a rare groove DJ or psychedelic rock enthusiast or soul and funk lover, or just fascinated by the music industry scams, these records offer a strange yet fascinating piece of history. And what about the artists? Well, they were never asked for permission, they were never informed that their music had been released, and you can imagine very clearly that they of course did not receive a dime for their work. Due to my interviews with musicians from back in the day, some of these artists are not even aware by now that their music had been released back in the days. And that's, for me, an absolutely crime. So yes, maybe no charges were made against these people, but I think at the other end, the people who created that music were totally forgotten about this. So I think it's very important that we get these reissues from tech scam labels, that nowadays also people can enjoy the music without paying a couple of thousands of euros or dollars to enjoy the music. And to make sure that the people who created that music get at least a little income from their work. Let's get into some rare tech scam records. And one of the holy grails from these tech scam labels is Stonewall, and I already mentioned it, from 1976. It was released on Tiger Lily, and it's a hard rock psychedelic album. Only a handful of copies exist, and if you find a copy, it's at least 5,000 euros or dollars or even more. Then we have from TSG The Topics. The album was called Giving Up. A recent copy on eBay sold for around 6,000 euros. Another one from Tiger Lily is Together. This has only been sold 2 times on the internet. I've checked with PopPsych, I've checked with Discogs, and it's also nowadays a couple of thousand euros. I already mentioned it, it's Terra from 1977. That was released on Baby Grand Records, and that's an absolutely fantastic soul and funk album. Mario and the Group, A Taste from 1976 on TSG, a Latin jazz funk album. If you find one, you need to pay at least a couple of $1,000. And you can see also with the Topics and also with this one that they had used stock photos to put them on the cover to make the production cost as cheap as possible. Also with the Together album I mentioned earlier, you just have that cover with the letterings on it, because everything needed to be as cheap as possible. From Tiger Lily, once again, we have the Jackson Sisters, also released in 1976, which is a rare funk and soul album, and it features the groove I Believe in Miracles. You find this one a little more often, but once again, that's not a cheap one. Another one I want to point out is the Sounds of the City Experience. Also super rare one to find, and if you have the chance, check that out. I do hope I could answer all your questions regarding tech scam labels, and of course there were tech scam labels for rock, for jazz. It's not considered a soul and funk only topic. It has been done on all kind of genres because that was the best way to cash in. Thank you for watching. If you liked that video, I highly suggest that you're checking out the playlist appearing here. and I catch you on the next one.